The cameras had barely settled when the air inside the hall cracked with tension. Every eye was fixed on the two figures at the center stage, their presence so heavy it seemed to pull the entire nation into that single moment. Millions at home leaned closer to their screens, waiting for the first words to fall, waiting for the first blow to land. And then it happened. With a smirk, the man who had built his career on arrogance and division leaned forward into the microphone and unleashed a remark so cutting, so drenched in contempt, that the crowd gasped before the words had even finished echoing. He mocked not only his rival, but the millions who saw themselves reflected in that rival's story. Immigrants, families, dreamers who had fought for their place in America. The insult did not just land on one man. It hit every household that had ever been told they were outsiders. It hit every worker who had been told they did not belong. The villain had thrown the first punch, not just against his opponent, but against the values the audience held sacred. And in that silence after the insult, something shifted. The cameras cut to the man in the crosshairs. Calm, composed, his face unflinching. He did not blink. He did not flinch. His silence was heavier than any insult, heavier than the room could hold. Viewers at home could feel it, that quiet storm brewing behind his measured expression. Everyone in that hall knew the confrontation had only just begun. The question burning across America was not what had been said, but how the man on the receiving end would answer, and what came next would shake the debate and the country to its core. Long before the insult thundered through that auditorium, the night had already carried the weight of history. This was no ordinary debate. It was a collision of two Americas, broadcast into living rooms, phones, and classrooms across the nation. The stage lights blazed, not just on two men, but on the choices that defined an entire generation. On one side stood the figure who had built his platform on fear, division, and the myth of exclusion. On the other stood the man whose very life embodied the promise that America belongs to everyone who dares to claim it with sweat, sacrifice, and hope. Every word mattered, every pause, every glance. The immigrant mother watching from her kitchen, the student streaming from a crowded dorm, the veteran who had fought under a flag that now seemed contested, all of them understood that this was not about ego. It was about whether the American story still had room for them. The villain's insult was more than political theater. It was an attempt to slam the door shut on millions who had fought to belong. His smirk said, "This country is mine, not yours." And that is why the moment crackled. With urgency, the stakes were not policies on paper. The stakes were dignity, belonging, and the soul of the nation itself. For the hero, this was more than personal. It was generational. Every attack on his name carried the echoes of attacks on those who had been told to change their accents, hide their roots, or silence their dreams. He knew the weight he carried, and he knew that in this instant, millions carried it with him. The crowd sat restless, the air heavy, waiting for the response that could not be delayed. And yet, what made the silence so electric was the knowledge that the real confrontation was still to come. America had witnessed arrogance before, but never in this form, never with so much on the line, because what happened next would not simply be a rebuttal. It would be a turning point, a moment so raw, so unforgettable, that it would leave the country gasping and history itself taking notes. To understand the weight of what unfolded that night, one must look at the man who cast the first stone. His rise was never built on unity, nor on lifting others, but on the art of division. For years, he had perfected the language of mockery, turning it into a political weapon. Every insult became a headline, every outburst a spectacle. The cameras loved him, not for his wisdom, but for the drama he created. And in a world where controversy became currency, he was wealthy beyond measure. He had long painted himself as the champion of the forgotten, but his words betrayed him. Time and again, he aimed his sharpest jabs at those who could not answer back: the powerless, the marginalized, the voiceless. Immigrants were his favorite target. He told crowds that they were the enemy, that they drained the nation, that they did not belong. And each time he spoke, his followers roared as if hatred itself was proof of strength. But behind the bravado was a man terrified of losing control. He had grown addicted to dominance, addicted to the applause that came from putting others down. Without it, he feared being exposed as ordinary. His insults were shields, his cruelty a mask for fragility he could never admit. And that fragility was never more visible than when he stood across from someone whose very existence disproved his vision of America. His history was littered with scandals, failures, and contradictions. The same man who claimed to protect workers had built fortunes on their backs. The same man who claimed to honor families had divided them with policies that tore children from parents. The same man who spoke of loyalty betrayed allies the moment it suited him. Yet he spun each betrayal into another performance, convincing many that strength meant never admitting wrong. And so, when he stepped onto that stage, he carried not just arrogance, but the weight of every unchallenged insult he had ever delivered. He believed, as he always had, that his words could not be pierced, that his swagger alone could silence an opponent. That was his mistake, for across from him stood someone who had endured storms he could never imagine, someone who had faced rejection and risen anyway. The villain's past was his greatest weakness, though he was blind to it. Each cruel line he spoke tied him more tightly to the persona he had built, a persona that thrived on conflict but faltered in the face of dignity. He did not realize that his history had prepared him for this fall, that the patterns of arrogance and mockery he had lived by would set the stage for his most devastating defeat. And as he smirked, convinced he had once again stolen the spotlight, the audience at home began to sense it too. This was not a man in control. This was a man standing at the edge of his own unraveling. What would happen when someone finally refused to bow? The answer was coming, and it would be unlike anything he had ever faced. Before the cameras, before the stage, before the clash that would seize the nation, there was a story carried quietly within the man who now stood in the spotlight. His life had not been written in privilege, nor carved in entitlement. It had been forged in sacrifice, shaped by the countless moments where dignity was the only currency he had left. Born into a family that carried both dreams and burdens, he learned early what it meant to fight for a place at the table. His parents, immigrants who came with little more than hope, taught him that every barrier could be broken, not with arrogance, but with perseverance. In school, he had felt the sting of being told he did not belong, of hearing his name mispronounced until it lost its shape. Yet rather than shrink, he grew sharper. Every dismissal became fuel. Every rejection became a lesson. He rose not by silencing who he was, but by embracing it. By the time he entered public life, he carried within him the voices of millions who had faced the same doubt, the same exclusion, and who longed to see someone rise without apology. His journey into politics was not born of ambition for power, but of necessity. He had watched neighbors work double shifts only to fall behind, watched families split apart by laws that did not see their humanity. For him, leadership was never about dominance. It was about service. Each step upward came with resistance. Yet with every victory, he proved that America could be reimagined to include those it once ignored. By the night of the debate, he had become more than a man with a microphone. He had become a mirror in which millions saw themselves. The mother balancing two jobs, the student carrying the weight of an accent, the worker whose hands told the story of labor without recognition, all of them could see their struggles reflected in his calm gaze. He stood not only for himself, but for every silent fight carried in kitchens, factories, classrooms, and crowded buses across the country. And that is what made the insult sting so sharply. It was not an attack on a single man. It was an attack on every immigrant family that had ever been told to go back, on every child who had ever been told their story did not matter. Yet what the villain miscalculated was that his target had been trained by a lifetime of storms. He knew how to stand tall in the face of cruelty because cruelty was not new. He knew how to turn pain into power because power had never been handed to him. As the lights bore down and millions leaned in, the stage was no longer just about two men. It was about two Americas colliding, one that thrived on fear and another that carried hope. And in that collision, the man who had carried so much silence prepared to speak words that would echo far beyond the walls of that hall. The insult had landed, the silence had stretched, and now the debate began to pulse with raw tension. The moderators tried to steady the atmosphere, shifting to policy, but no one in the room cared about charts or statistics in that moment. All eyes remained fixed on the two men, waiting to see whether the wound inflicted would fester or be answered. The villain leaned back in his chair with smug satisfaction, mistaking silence for surrender. He struck again, this time louder, feeding. The crowd lines meant to entertain rather than enlighten. He mocked his opponent's heritage, twisted his record, and sneered with the confidence of a man who believed ridicule was power. His voice rose like a hammer pounding at the same spot, certain that eventually something would crack. But the man he faced did not break. Instead, he listened. He let the words echo, let the audience absorb the ugliness, and in his stillness created more pressure than shouting ever could. His calm was unnerving, and slowly the villain's energy shifted from amusement to irritation. He doubled down, his tone sharper now, his insults scattered with desperation disguised as bravado. Then came the first response, not in anger, but in clarity. The hero finally spoke, not to his rival, but to the nation. He reminded the audience that America's greatness was not built on tearing people down, but on lifting them up. His voice carried not fire, but steadiness, the kind that cannot be shaken. For every insult hurled at him, he answered with dignity, with facts, with a truth that was heavier than any slur. The crowd reacted. Gasps rippled, some erupted in applause, and the villain, for the first time that night, faltered. His eyes flickered with unease. The moment he had expected to dominate was slipping, and he could feel it. Social media lit up as viewers clipped the exchange, their comments brimming with disbelief and awe. He is dismantling him without even raising his voice. Yet the night was far from over. The tension was only beginning to rise, the stakes growing sharper with every exchange. What had begun as an insult was transforming into something larger, a battle of values, of identity, of America itself. The villain still had weapons left, still had insults to throw, still believed he could drag his opponent down into the mud. But the man across from him had a different plan, because what came next was not just a counter. It was a strike so precise, so devastating, that it would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of the debate stage. And it was coming sooner than anyone expected. The villain had thrown everything he knew how to throw. Sneers, smirks, and insults dressed as questions. Each word was meant to sting, to provoke, to corner his rival into anger. But what he did not expect was the moment that followed, the moment when silence transformed into thunder. The hero leaned forward, his hands steady on the podium, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the noise of the room. "You can mock me," he began, his tone measured, "but what you are really mocking is every family that built this country, brick by brick, field by field, dream by dream." His words did not explode. They unfolded, deliberate, each syllable a stone laid upon the other. And in that calm precision lay their power. The audience shifted, their attention locked. The villain tried to interrupt, but this time the moderators held him back. The stage belonged to the man who had weathered storms far greater than insults. He continued, his voice steady, recounting how immigrants had carried America forward. Through war, through recession, through tragedy. He spoke not as a politician, but as a witness to sacrifice, as a son of parents who had given more than they had ever received. The villain chuckled, rolling his eyes, but it only deepened the impact of what came next. "When you insult me," the hero declared, "you insult the nurse who saved lives in a pandemic, the soldier who wore this nation's flag into battle, the teacher who taught your children, the worker who built the roads you travel. You insult America itself." The room gasped. Applause erupted. Viewers at home felt goosebumps rise on their arms. The villain opened his mouth to fire back, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the crowd. In that instant, his power seemed to wither. His smirk, once his weapon, faltered under the weight of the words that had been spoken, and then came the line, the one that would live far beyond the night. With a pause that stretched just long enough to pull every ear closer, the hero looked directly at his opponent and said, "You spend your time trying to divide us, because you are afraid of what we become when we stand together." The sentence hung heavy, a blade cutting through arrogance. The villain blinked, his expression betraying the first flicker of defeat. Social media erupted instantly. Clips spread within minutes. The moment he destroyed him. Hashtags soared, trending across platforms. Commentators replayed the words with awe, some calling it the single most powerful line delivered in a political debate in years. It was not just a clapback, it was history unfolding live. The villain shuffled, desperate to regain control, but every attempt came across weaker, smaller. The man who had once dominated rooms with insults now looked cornered, dwarfed by a calmness he could not rattle. The hero did not need to raise his voice. He had already won the crowd, already etched his line into the memory of the nation. Still, the night was not finished. The villain had one last card to play, one last desperate swing to reclaim what he was losing. But the more he pushed, the clearer it became that he was unraveling before the country's eyes. The question that lingered was not whether he would fall, but how devastating the final blow would be. The moment the words left his lips, the room erupted into a storm of reactions. Applause crashed like thunder, gasps rippled like waves, and somewhere in the noise, a chant began to rise. Faint, at first, then louder, swelling into the kind of collective energy that could not be contained. The villain shifted in place, his smirk dissolving as the reality settled in. The line he thought would define the night had been buried under something unforgettable. But the stage was only the beginning. Outside the auditorium, the world was already moving. Phones lit up across living rooms, college dorms, and late-night diners. Clips of the exchange spread with lightning speed, hashtags soaring to the top of social media feeds within minutes. "Stand Together" began trending, followed by "Thigh Mic Drop Moment." Memes were created in real time, split-screen images showing the villain's scowl against the hero's calm gaze. Commentators, journalists, and celebrities chimed in, each replaying the moment as if it were a scene out of a movie. For those who had long felt silenced, it was validation. The immigrant worker waking before dawn saw himself honored in those words. The young student teased for her accent replayed the clip again and again, feeling as if her story finally mattered. Even the skeptics admitted that the balance of the night had shifted, that something had happened which could not be spun away. The villain's camp tried to respond, pushing out statements, doubling down on bravado, but it was too late. The soundbite belonged to the hero now. News anchors replayed the moment on a loop, panelists dissected every phrase, and late night, comedians turned the villain's expression into a punchline. What had been intended as mockery had transformed into humiliation. And yet, even as the wave of celebration spread, the tension did not ease. For everyone watching, the sense lingered that the night was not finished. If this was the turning point, what would the final blow look like? The villain had been cornered, his arrogance punctured, but he was not the type to retreat quietly. He would strike again, and the world waited, breath held, for what that desperate strike would bring. The room had fallen into that electric silence that only follows history being made. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, waiting to see who would dare move first. Then the hero leaned forward, his voice steady, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of generations. He did not shout. He did not need to. His calm presence was sharper than any blade. "This is not about me," he said, his eyes sweeping across the chamber, then outward as if addressing the millions beyond the cameras. "This is about who we are willing to become. Do we allow fear to dictate our future, or do we finally recognize the strength in our diversity? Do we let cruelty masquerade as leadership, or do we reclaim compassion as the true measure of power?" The audience hung on each word. Even those who had come expecting to jeer found themselves unsettled, confronted with a truth too clear to ignore. The villain tried to interject, but his voice faltered under the weight of the moment. Every attempt at interruption only made the contrast more glaring. Arrogance against dignity, bluster against conviction. The hero pressed on, his tone rising, not with anger but with unshakable resolve. America's story has never belonged to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the people who keep building, who keep believing, who keep standing even when they are told to sit down. That is our strength. That is our legacy. And tonight, that is our choice. The crescendo built not from volume, but from resonance. The words cut through walls, across screens, into living rooms, into the hearts of those who needed them most. It was the kind of speech that would be replayed in classrooms, cited in essays, remembered in family conversations. It did not just answer an insult, it defined a vision. By the time he finished, the chamber shook, not from chaos, but from something more profound. Applause rose again, unstoppable now, like a tide breaking through a dam. The villain sat back, diminished, eyes darting as if searching for a way to reclaim what had slipped from his grasp. But there was none. For the viewers, for the audience, for history itself, the message was unmistakable. A line had been drawn, a torch had been passed, and as the cameras cut away, one truth lingered in the air. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after, America woke to a different kind of silence. The quiet hum that follows a storm when people realize the landscape has changed. Headlines screamed with urgency, but beneath the noise, a deeper current pulsed. Through the nation, families gathered around kitchen tables, young immigrants scrolled through their phones, workers exchanged glances at bus stops, and for the first time in a long time, they felt something rare. Recognition. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire across every platform. Students replayed it on campus lawns, replaying the line that cut deepest. "This is not about me. This is about who we are willing to become." That single sentence had transformed into a rallying cry, etched onto posters, woven into chants, printed on T-shirts that sold out within hours. It was no longer just a moment in a chamber. It had become a movement in the streets. But movements come with weight. Supporters felt pride surging through them, yet they also knew the backlash was coming. Already, pundits scrambled to spin the story, trying to dilute its power, painting it as a performance rather than a prophecy. The villain's allies promised retaliation, warning that the fight was far from over. And that was true. The fight was only beginning. Still, there was no denying the shift. For too long, the narrative had been controlled by those who thrived on division, but now a counter-story had been planted, one rooted in dignity, inclusion, and unshakable courage. It was fragile, yes, but it was also contagious. Every replay, every share, every whispered conversation gave it more life. History is not written in a single speech, yet some words echo louder than others, bending the arc of what comes next. In classrooms, teachers explained why it mattered. In churches, imams, and synagogues, leaders wove it into sermons about justice. In homes where children had asked if they belonged, parents finally had an answer they could say with pride. And as the sun set on that day, the air was thick with the sense that a seed had been planted in America's soil. What would grow from it was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. People had seen the mask of cruelty slip, and they had witnessed the power of courage rise. The legacy was not sealed in that chamber. It was sealed in the hearts of those who now believed the future could still be claimed, and who were determined never to forget the night everything began to change.